Hello, my name is Chess. The topic of today's video is the question, what makes a game fun? Before we can answer this question, we should start with what is a game and what is fun. Then we can take a look at what aspects of games make them fun, and go over the science of how we have fun and why that drives us to do things. I will touch on game design in this video, but the purpose is mostly to serve as a detailed explanation of concepts that I will refer to more briefly when analyzing real-world game design in later videos. So first off, what is a game? One definition is a structured form of play or sport, often a competitive one decided by skill, strength, or luck. Play is often seen as frivolous or childish, but is seen in many different intelligent species and is incredibly important for all ages. It helps in physical and mental development, hand-eye coordination, social skills, integration into new social groups, practicing new concepts or skills, learning useful habits, and many other important things. The massive amount of potential benefits help explain why we are instinctually driven to play. Games take the idea of play and formalize it with rules. They provide challenge, interaction, mental or physical stimulation, or just plain entertainment. And video games specifically are essentially just a game that's played on or with a computer. Next, we have the question of what is fun. Fun is defined in the Oxford English Dictionary as amusement, especially lively or playful. The word fun is often mentioned in the same context as play, such as that definition, or with phrases like fun and games, although I would argue fun is a byproduct, or just one of the goals of play. Fun also relates to enjoyment and the flow state. Flow is an important concept, and closely linked with the concept of mastery. In 2004, Ralph Koster published a book called The Theory of Fun, which argued that fun in games came from skill mastery. This book was influenced by the writings of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, a Hungarian-American psychologist who identified 3 requirements for a flow state to exist. 1. You must be performing a challenging activity that requires skill. 2. The activity must provide clear goals and feedback. And 3, the outcome is uncertain, but can be influenced by your actions. So you are in control of your actions, but not in direct control of the outcome itself. Generally, a flow state happens in games when there's a good balance between skills and challenge. Too much skill and not enough challenge leads to boredom, and too much challenge and not enough skill knocks you out of the flow state and causes anxiety or frustration. When there's a good balance, the players find themselves in the flow state and get a good sense of mastery or continual improvement from playing. If you've ever lost track of time in a game or practicing a skill, you may have been in the flow state. Now that we have some definitions, we still need to find out how fun applies to games. There have been many attempts to categorize how players interact with games and what makes games good. One attempt for categorizing players is the Bartle taxonomy of player types, which is a classification of video game players according to their preferred actions within the game. This is based on a 1996 paper by Richard Bartle, hence the name Bartle taxonomy. He broke down players into 4 groups based on 2 axes: acting on versus interacting with, and players versus world. Players that favor acting on other players were called killers. In single-player games, they focus on things like power gaming and beating other players' scores or speedrunning. In multiplayer, they like competing with others or hunting down others and dominating them. Players that favor acting on the world were called achievers. In single-player games, these gamers like focusing on 100%ing, accomplishing things, and completing quests. In multiplayer games, they like showing off wealth, achievements, or cosmetics. They want to compare themselves with others based on their victories over the game world. Players that favor interaction with players were called socializers. These usually shy away from single-player games, though they might like games with complex dialogue or significant NPC interactions. These gamers also focus on sharing their single-player sessions with others, maybe streaming or recording Let's Plays. In multiplayer games, these players flock to groups, guilds, and socializing in-game. Finally, players that favor interaction with the world were called explorers. These players focus on exploring strange and mysterious places, solving puzzles, investigating lore, or finding glitches and Easter eggs. These focus on how players interact with the game, but don't directly help in designing a game to facilitate these types of players. Another approach that I find more useful is breaking down what aspects of games that players like. This helps categorize games and allows us to measure features against how they support or hinder any given aspect. Here is a list of some components that a player might look for in a game. Destruction. Players that are motivated by destruction enjoy mayhem and chaos in games. Things like guns, explosives, breaking things. They might build things in games, but only in order to blow it up later. VR games tend to appeal to these people due to complex and immersive physics simulations that's possible. A good example of a game that features destruction is Teardown. Excitement. Players motivated by excitement enjoy fast-paced gameplay and action, full of surprises and thrills. These kind of games tend to have a lot of visual simulation and variety. A good example of a game that features excitement is Doom Eternal. Competition. Players motivated by competition like duels or matches and climbing the leaderboards. Games without rankings or player versus player conflict could also demonstrate this in the form of things like speedrunning. A good example of a game that features competition is Apex Legends. Community. Players motivated by community like being on a team and interacting with other people. They tend to enjoy chatting and socializing with other people. Similarly to the socialization we previously mentioned, this could also include streaming or complex interactions with NPCs. A good example of a game that features community is the Jackbox Party Packs. Challenge. Players motivated by challenge like high difficulty, practice, and in-game or self-imposed challenges. These kind of games are often driven by mastering a skill and complex moves or gameplay. Importantly, difficulty is not the same thing as punishment, but we will cover punishment exhaustively later. A good example of a game that features challenge is Elden Ring. Strategy. Players motivated by strategy like planning ahead, making decisions, and executing on longer-term strategies. These games often have complex decision-making, partial information, or complicated interacting systems. A good example of a game that features strategy is Civilization VI, or other Civilization games. Completion. Players motivated by completion like gathering all the collectibles and completing all the missions in games. They're driven by quantifiable, consistent rewards that show progress. A good example of a game that features completion is Breath of the Wild. Power. Players motivated by power like growth in terms of character levels and equipment upgrades, gathering wealth and status. A good example of a game that features power is World of Warcraft. Fantasy. Players motivated by fantasy like being immersed in the game world, being somewhere else or someone else. Engaging lore and rich fantasy worlds enhance this aspect. A good example of a game that features fantasy is Skyrim. Story. Players motivated by story like elaborate plots, interesting characters, deep interactions, history, and drama. A good example of a game that features story is Persona 5 Royal. Design. Players motivated by design like expressing individuality, customization, personal flair, and creativity. These games offer creative control over some amount of the content and the ability to design your own creations. A good example of a game that features design is Spore. Discovery. Players motivated by discovery like exploring, experimenting, and tinkering. These games often have complex systems or rules interacting, unknowns to uncover, or large worlds. A good example of a game that features discovery is Subnautica. Sensory enjoyment. Players motivated by sensory enjoyment like pleasant sensory experiences, satisfying sounds, visuals, or gameplay, like the game equivalent of popping bubble wrap. A good example of a game that features sensory enjoyment is Abzu. Aesthetic enjoyment. Players motivated by aesthetic enjoyment like satisfying visuals, patterns, or artistic styles. A good example of a game that features aesthetic enjoyment is A Little to the Left. Playfulness. Players motivated by playfulness like messing around in a game, much like one would toss around a ball or play with toys. Games prominently featuring this are often sandbox style or have little in the way of actual gameplay goals, though it can be found in many games that are inherently fun to play in. A good game that features playfulness is BeamNG.Drive. Relaxation. Players motivated by relaxation like escaping real-world problems and turning off their brains and losing themselves in a task. These games often allow for mindless or repetitive tasks or low skill requirements. A game that features relaxation is Power Wash Simulator. And utilitarian motivations. Players with utilitarian motivations select a game for extrinsic reasons, such as the potential to make money with esports, or potential for creating content on a streaming platform. A good example of a game that features utilitarian motivations is Dota 2. You may be able to come up with other unique aspects, but I hope this list demonstrates that there are many different things that motivate people to play games. These aspects can help focus attempts when designing or analyzing games, and are also useful for categorizing games. So far, I've attempted to explain what aspects of games players like, but that is an incomplete answer to our original question. Often when someone asks the question, "What is fun about a game?" they're really asking what motivates you to play it. You can explain the mechanics of digging a hole in Minecraft or optimizing a factory in Factorio, but that doesn't explain why that particular thing is actually fun, or why you're so intent on doing it more. This is partially because there's a difference between liking something and wanting it. Most of the time in our lives, these things overlap. I like cake, so I want to eat cake. Makes sense. But sometimes we find ourselves in situations where what we enjoy and what we want disagree. Maybe we have fun every time we hang out with friends, but for some reason we dread actually going out to meet them. Or we know something is bad for us or sounds stupid, but we can't stop doing it. To explain why this kind of thing happens and how liking and wanting things misalign, we need to get into a bit of neuroscience. I would like to preface this by saying I am not an authority on any of this, and this is just my layman's understanding of what makes the brain tick. I'm mentioning it because it can really help explain how games influence people, but it's here just to help analyze video games and is not any kind of medical advice. With that out of the way, there's an area of the brain called the orbitofrontal cortex, which contains a hedonic circuit that is responsible for liking things or experiencing pleasure. When these circuits aren't working right, you could experience things like a loss of pleasure or depression, and when you really enjoy things, this probably plays a part in that experience. The orbitofrontal cortex also happens to be responsible for effort-reward computations, where the brain decides whether something is worth doing or not based on how much effort it thinks it'll take and the reward we expect to get. We'll circle back to this in a minute, but if you've ever thought, well, that's just too much work, you might have had this part whispering in your ear. A second area of the brain is called the nucleus accumbens, which is connected to the mesolimbic circuit, which is the circuit responsible for wanting things and rewards. It is governed by dopamine, and this part is generally what people are talking about when they say they get a dopamine hit from something. This plays a major role in reinforcement and learning, as well as things like addiction. A third area of interest is the emotional circuits of the brain, in places like the limbic system and the amygdala, which can heavily influence motivation, but aren't necessarily responsible for it themselves. For example, if you're very upset, you may not be very motivated to go out to the gym. Or more accurately, you are quite motivated to stay home. So the parts of the brain that deal with liking things, wanting things, and feeling are all kind of separate. Normally, if I perform an action like eating cake, the hedonic circuitry fires off and goes, "Oh, sugar, we like this." And then the reward circuits fire off, saying that the action we took of eating cake led to good feelings, so we should do it more, and it learns that it's a good thing to do. We will get into an easier to remember framework for learning in a minute. But first, I want to talk briefly on the previous example of not wanting to go out and see friends, but liking it every time we do. That can be partially explained by what is called prediction reward error processing. The brain predicts what it expects a reward to be, and then compares it against what we actually got. There are three possible outcomes here. The reward is better than expected, it got exactly the same as I thought it would, or the reward was less than expected. When we are pleasantly surprised, we learn to do a behavior more and update the expected reward to be better. When we receive exactly the reward we expect, we don't learn and keep the prediction the same. And finally, when we get something worse than we expect, we really hate that, and we update the expected reward to be worse. So basically, the brain is guessing when it calculates whether actions are worth it or not, but it gets better at guessing the more we try it out. Generally, this all works great, or at least good enough, but sometimes it can have problems. When it goes wrong, the expected reward could be way lower than it should be. So when we do effort-reward calculations, the brain thinks it's not worth doing something that you actually enjoy, and then it takes a lot of trial and error for the brain to correctly estimate how much you'll actually enjoy it. Let's take all of this complicated theory about brain chemicals and circuitry and turn it into something useful and easier to remember. To do that, we need to talk about conditioning, or how things learn. There are two types of conditioned learning that I will briefly explain: classical or Pavlovian conditioning, which happens because of a subject's instinctive responses, and operant conditioning, which depends on the willful actions of the subject. Classical conditioning was discovered by Ivan Pavlov in the early 1900s and is probably best explained by an example. If you take a dog and give it food, it will salivate, and if you ring a bell, it probably won't react, or at most would look at you funny. The process of classical conditioning would entail ringing the bell and then giving the dog food. After a few repetitions of this, eventually the dog will start to salivate just in response to the bell on its own. As another example, if every time you level up in a game, you hear a sound effect and you feel good, eventually you might hear that in a video and get the same feeling. Now on to operant conditioning. B.F. Skinner is often called the father of operant conditioning, and also studied this in the 1900s. If you've ever heard the term negative reinforcement, this is what they're talking about, although the term was almost certainly used incorrectly. Operant conditioning is broken into two dimensions, with a total of 4 categories. One dimension is reinforcement versus punishment, and the other dimension is positive versus negative. Reinforcement refers to making a behavior happen more often, and punishment refers to making a behavior happen less often. Positive means you are adding a stimulus, like an event or an object, and negative means you're taking a stimulus away. Let's break down each of the 4 categories. Positive reinforcement, usually just called reinforcement, happens when a behavior is followed by a stimulus that is rewarding, or the behavior is inherently rewarding. A classic example is the Skinner box, named after B.F. Skinner, where if a rat gets food every time it presses a lever, the rate of pressing the lever will go up. Negative reinforcement, sometimes called escape, happens when a behavior is followed by the removal of an unpleasant stimulus. In the Skinner box example, the unpleasant stimulus might be a loud horn constantly going off, and the negative reinforcement happens when a rat presses a lever to turn off the noise. Eventually, it will press the lever more and more to stop the constant horn. Positive punishment, usually just called punishment, happens when behavior is followed by a negative stimulus that you don't like. For example, if a rat gets shocked every time it presses a lever, the rate of pressing the lever will go down. Negative punishment happens when a behavior is followed by the removal of a stimulus. For example, taking away a child's toy after they misbehave would result in a decrease in the undesired behavior. A fifth factor is extinction, which is where a behavior is unlearned. For example, in the positive reinforcement example, if a rat is first given food many times for pressing a lever, but then it stops getting food as a reward, it will typically press the lever less often and eventually stop altogether, at which point the lever pressing would be said to be extinguished. Something to note is that there is more complexity here if you want to dig into it. For example, the rules for the time or number of actions between when reinforcement happen can dramatically change the effectiveness. A pattern commonly seen in games is called a variable ratio schedule, or a random reward schedule, where reinforcement occurs after a variable number of actions, and this schedule leads to very high persistent rates of response. This can be seen in loot chests that only sometimes give rare items. Additionally, these 4 types of conditioning are not created equal in terms of efficiency. Positive reinforcement works the best, but all of the others have issues. Negative reinforcement requires constant negative stimulus, which is profoundly irritating and will usually result in behavior other than the one you might want to happen. Positive punishment is prevalent in games, yet causes resentment, psychological damage in some cases, avoidance, or learning the wrong thing is bad. It requires immediate and consistent application of the negative stimulus to work, and even then, it wears off faster than reinforcement, and still risks training the wrong thing. Trying to get a cat to stop scratching a couch by spraying it with water might just make it avoid the couch and you entirely, instead of just not scratching, and it will probably make it dislike and distrust you. Negative punishment is also prevalent in games, yet also causes resentment, avoidance, and learning the wrong thing. If you take away someone's progress in a game to punish failure, for example, instead of learning that failure is bad, which they already know, they might learn that your game is bad and stop that instead. Both forms of punishment, often even in the best case, just cause suppression of behavior as long as it's punished, instead of actually extinguishing it. They also both cause negative feelings, like frustration and fear. So, we've talked about what is fun, what are games, what draws people to games, and a bunch of science stuff about learning. So let's put it together to answer the question of what makes games fun. A fun game draws the player in with the promise of content that they will enjoy, and then through its gameplay provides inherently rewarding experiences that keep them playing. I would argue that good game design makes it clear what is supposed to be fun about the game and rewards the player for participating in those aspects. Bad game design muddies the water, frustrates the player, and fails to support the intended gameplay. I hope this has been useful in explaining why people play games. Please stay tuned for more concrete examples focusing on the design for specific games where we can put these theories into practice. Thank you all for watching.